Margaret Sinclair never imagined she would spend her daughter's wedding day holding a manila envelope that could destroy everything beautiful about the celebration. But there she stood, watching her ex-husband Richard walk into the Rose Garden reception with his 28-year-old girlfriend on his arm, the same woman who had shattered their 22-year marriage. The same woman who now wore a silk emerald dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent, paid for with money that should have supported their daughter Emma through graduate school. Margaret's fingers tightened around the envelope containing documents that would turn this picture-perfect wedding into a battlefield, and for the first time in 3 years, she felt completely ready for war. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret had always believed that some betrayals cut so deep they rewrite the very foundation of who you are. She learned this truth on a cold February morning when she found the credit card statements hidden behind Richard's law books. Statements showing expensive dinners at restaurants she had never been to, weekend trips to Napa Valley while she was told he was attending legal conferences, and jewelry purchases that never appeared under their Christmas tree. The amounts were staggering, but what broke her heart was realizing how long he had been living this double life while she managed their household, raised their daughter, and worked 50-hour weeks as a real estate agent to supplement his supposedly struggling practice. The house they lived in for 18 years sat on Maple Ridge Drive in Westchester County, a colonial with white shutters and a wraparound porch where Margaret had spent countless mornings drinking coffee and planning their future. She had found the property herself, negotiated the purchase, and designed every room renovation. When Emma was born, Margaret converted the upstairs office into a nursery, painting soft yellow walls and installing custom shelving for children's books. She chose every light fixture, every piece of crown molding, every flower in the front garden. The house was her masterpiece. But during the divorce proceedings, Richard's attorney argued that since the down payment came from Richard's family trust, he deserved the larger share of equity. Emma had always been the bright star that kept their family constellation intact, a brilliant student who graduated summa cum laude from Boston University with degrees in environmental science and public policy. She possessed the kind of fierce intelligence that made Margaret proud, and the kind of generous heart that made her vulnerable to manipulation. After college, Emma moved to Portland to work for a nonprofit focused on sustainable urban development, building a life that was purposeful and independent. When she announced her engagement to David Chen, a soft-spoken architect who shared her passion for environmental design, Margaret felt genuine joy for the first time since the divorce was finalized. The relationship between Emma and Richard had always been complicated by his emotional unavailability and her desperate desire for his approval. Richard attended maybe half of Emma's school events, citing work obligations or important client meetings, but he never missed an opportunity to take credit for her achievements. When Emma received a full scholarship to graduate school, Richard told his colleagues it was because of the strong, intellectual foundation he had provided her. When she was promoted to project director at her nonprofit, he claimed it was due to the work ethic he had instilled in her. Margaret watched these interactions with growing frustration, seeing how Emma's face would light up whenever Richard showed the slightest interest in her life, and how it would dim when he inevitably turned the conversation back to his own accomplishments. The divorce settlement had been a masterclass in legal manipulation, orchestrated by Richard's connections in the local bar association. Despite Margaret's contributions to their joint assets and her role in maintaining their household for over 2 decades, she walked away with significantly less than she deserved. The judge, a longtime colleague of Richard's from their days at Columbia Law School, seemed unusually sympathetic to arguments about Richard's future earning potential and the sacrifices he had made for his career. Margaret's attorney, a competent but overwhelmed public defender, was clearly outmatched by Richard's team of specialists who had prepared for months while Margaret was still hoping they could work things out through mediation. Richard's law practice, which he had claimed was struggling during their marriage, suddenly became remarkably profitable once the divorce proceedings began. Bills that had been marked as uncollectible for years were mysteriously paid in full. Clients who had supposedly terminated their relationships with the firm renewed their contracts with substantial retainers. Margaret suspected he had been hiding assets for months, but proving it would have required private investigators and forensic accountants she could not afford. She accepted the settlement because fighting it would have cost more than she would gain, and because she was exhausted from 3 years of legal battles that had already consumed her savings and her faith in the justice system. The most painful part of the settlement was losing the family home. Richard agreed to buy out her share at a price based on an appraisal that seemed deliberately low, though Margaret could not prove the appraiser had been influenced. She moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in White Plains, a perfectly adequate space that felt like exile after 18 years of calling Maple Ridge Drive home. The apartment had thin walls, a tiny kitchen, and a view of the parking lot. But Margaret forced herself to see it as freedom rather than defeat. She decorated with furniture from discount stores and artwork from local artists, creating a space that was entirely hers, even if it was smaller than she had planned. Margaret threw herself into her real estate career with the intensity of someone who had no other choice. She had always been successful, but now she became relentless. She worked weekends, took on difficult clients that other agents avoided, and specialized in helping divorced women navigate the complex process of buying their first independent homes. Her commission checks grew larger, and she began saving every extra dollar with the focused determination of someone building a fortress against future vulnerability. Within 2 years, she had enough money for a substantial down payment on a new property, something Richard knew nothing about. Meanwhile, Richard's relationship with Sophia Martinez became increasingly public. Sophia was a paralegal at a competing firm who was 24 years old when their affair began, making her closer in age to Emma than to Richard. She had glossy black hair, a wardrobe that suggested expensive tastes, and a social media presence filled with photos from restaurants and vacation destinations that Margaret recognized from their old credit card statements. Richard introduced Sophia to his professional circle as if she were a serious partner rather than the woman who had destroyed his family, and his colleagues seemed to accept this narrative without question. Emma's reaction to Sophia was carefully controlled politeness that barely concealed her discomfort. She attended a few family dinners that Richard organized, sitting through awkward conversations where Sophia tried to position herself as a maternal figure despite being only 6 years older than Emma. Margaret watched her daughter navigate these situations with grace that made her proud and anger that made her protective. Emma never complained directly, but Margaret could see the strain in her careful word choices and forced smiles during their weekly phone calls. The announcement of Emma's engagement brought out the worst competitive instincts in both parents. Richard immediately began planning what he called the celebration our daughter deserves, which seemed to involve spending impressive amounts of money to demonstrate his success and generosity. He researched venues in the Hamptons and Westchester County, talked about hiring wedding planners from Manhattan, and mentioned guest lists that included his professional colleagues and their wives. Margaret's chest tightened when she realized he was planning to use Emma's wedding as a networking opportunity and social statement. Margaret's approach was different, but equally determined. She wanted Emma to have the wedding of her dreams without the political undercurrents and performative elements that Richard seemed to favor. She researched venues that matched Emma's environmental values, suggested catering companies that used locally sourced ingredients, and helped Emma design invitations that reflected her artistic sensibilities rather than her father's professional status. The planning process became a subtle tug-of-war between parents who wanted very different things for their daughter's special day. The conversation that changed everything happened on a rainy Thursday evening in April when Emma called Margaret in tears.
Richard had just informed Emma that he would be bringing Sophia to the wedding as his date, framing it as a natural step in their relationship and suggesting that Emma should be mature enough to accept the situation. Emma felt trapped between her desire to avoid family drama and her instinctive understanding that having her father's mistress at her wedding was inappropriate and hurtful. She asked Margaret what she thought, and Margaret found herself in the impossible position of wanting to protect her daughter while avoiding direct confrontation with Richard's decision. Margaret spent that night sitting in her small apartment kitchen, drinking tea and thinking about power dynamics and justice and the ways that people who hurt others often face no meaningful consequences for their actions. Richard had destroyed their marriage, manipulated their divorce settlement, and now wanted to bring his mistress to their daughter's wedding without considering how this might affect Emma or Margaret. He seemed to believe that his money and social status gave him the right to define reality for everyone around him, and Margaret realized she was tired of allowing him to operate from that assumption. The next morning, Margaret made a series of phone calls that would set in motion the most satisfying revenge she had ever planned. She contacted Emma's chosen venue, Rosewood Manor, a historic estate in Tarrytown that specialized in intimate celebrations with gardens, vintage architecture, and views of the Hudson River. The venue coordinator, a cheerful woman named Linda, confirmed that Richard had indeed attempted to negotiate special arrangements for additional guests and had asked about upgrading various aspects of the reception. Margaret listened carefully, taking notes about dates, times, and specific requests. Margaret's second call was to her real estate attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia Wolfe, who had helped her with several complex property transactions. Margaret explained that she was interested in purchasing a commercial property that was currently operating as an event venue, and she needed to move quickly if the right opportunity presented itself. Patricia promised to research the ownership structure of Rosewood Manor and provide a detailed report within 48 hours. The research revealed exactly what Margaret had hoped to discover. Rosewood Manor was owned by an elderly couple, Harold and June Peterson, who had been operating the venue for over 30 years, but were ready to retire and move to Florida to be closer to their grandchildren. They had quietly listed the property with a commercial real estate agent, but the sale was progressing slowly due to the specialized nature of the business and the significant investment required from potential buyers. The asking price was substantial, but within Margaret's range if she was willing to use most of her savings and take on a considerable mortgage. Margaret spent the weekend driving past Rosewood Manor, studying the property from every angle and imagining herself as its owner. The main house was a brick Georgian, built in the 1920s, with formal gardens, a carriage house that had been converted into additional reception space, and mature oak trees that created natural privacy from the neighboring properties. The business operated seasonally from April through October, hosting approximately 60 weddings and private events each year. The financial records showed consistent profitability, though Harold and June had not invested in marketing or modernization in recent years. The decision to purchase Rosewood Manor was both rational and emotional. From a business perspective, it represented a solid investment in a stable industry where Margaret's real estate experience would be valuable. The venue had an excellent reputation, a strong client base, and potential for growth under younger ownership. From a personal perspective, owning the venue where Emma's wedding would take place gave Margaret a level of control over the situation that she had not experienced since her divorce. She would finally be able to protect her daughter and herself from Richard's manipulations, and she would do it from a position of strength rather than defensive reaction. The purchase process required moving with unusual speed and discretion. Margaret arranged financing through a private lender who specialized in commercial real estate acquisitions, using her apartment and investment portfolio as collateral. She hired a business attorney to review the contracts and a property inspector to identify any potential issues with the buildings or grounds. The Petersons were delighted to find a buyer who understood the emotional investment they had made in the venue and who promised to maintain its character while updating its operations. The closing took place on a humid morning in late June, exactly 6 weeks before Emma's wedding date. Margaret signed document after document, transferring nearly everything she had worked for since her divorce into ownership of a business she had never planned to run. Harold Peterson handed her a heavy brass keyring and a leather-bound folder containing vendor contracts, employee information, and 30 years of accumulated wisdom about the event industry. June Peterson hugged her and whispered that she knew the venue would be in good hands, that she could see Margaret had the kind of fierce, protective instinct that made for successful event planning. Margaret spent the following weeks immersing herself in the daily operations of Rosewood Manor. She met with the catering staff, learned about the sound system and lighting equipment, and walked through the grounds with the head gardener to understand the maintenance schedule for the flowers and lawns. She reviewed Emma's wedding contract and realized that Richard had attempted to make several changes to the original agreement, including adding extra guests beyond the contracted number and requesting access to areas of the property that were typically restricted during events. The most interesting discovery came when Margaret reviewed the payment records for Emma's wedding. Richard had insisted on paying for the venue as his contribution to the celebration, but his payments had been irregular and insufficient. He still owed a significant balance that would typically result in cancellation of the event if not resolved within 30 days of the wedding date. Margaret realized that Richard had been assuming he could negotiate additional payment terms or pressure the venue into accepting partial payment, relying on his charm and professional status to smooth over financial shortcomings. Margaret made her own payments to settle Emma's account in full, ensuring that her daughter's wedding would proceed without financial complications. She then began planning her own surprise for the reception, something that would demonstrate to Richard and Sophia and everyone present that actions have consequences and that underestimating Margaret Sinclair was a serious mistake. The wedding planning continued with Emma remaining unaware of her mother's new ownership of the venue. Margaret participated in phone calls with Linda, the event coordinator, playing the role of concerned mother rather than revealing her identity as the new owner. She listened to Emma's excitement about the final menu selections, the flower arrangements, and the string quartet that would play during the ceremony. She helped Emma choose her dress, a simple but elegant design that reflected her environmental values by using sustainably sourced silk and minimal embellishment. 2 weeks before the wedding, Richard called Margaret to discuss logistics and seemed unusually cheerful about the arrangements. He mentioned that Sophia was excited about attending such a beautiful venue and that he was looking forward to introducing her to Emma's new in-laws and their circle of friends. Margaret listened to his casual tone and realized that he genuinely believed his presence with Sophia would be accepted as normal and appropriate. He seemed to have convinced himself that enough time had passed for everyone to move beyond the circumstances of their divorce and embrace his new relationship. Margaret's response was carefully neutral, expressing hope that the day would be beautiful and memorable for Emma and David. She did not mention her feelings about Sophia's attendance, did not reveal her knowledge of Richard's outstanding balance with the venue, and certainly did not hint at the surprise she had prepared. Richard seemed satisfied with her composure, perhaps interpreting it as acceptance or resignation rather than the calm confidence of someone holding a very strong hand. The final week before the wedding brought a flurry of last-minute preparations that tested Margaret's ability to maintain her double identity. As Emma's mother, she attended the rehearsal dinner and helped with small crises involving missing boutonnieres and nervous speeches. As the venue owner, she worked with her staff to ensure that every detail would be perfect and that the additional security measures she had requested would be implemented discreetly. Margaret had arranged for a professional photographer to document the entire event, including moments that guests might not notice but that would be important for her own purposes.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She had also hired additional security personnel who would be present in civilian clothes, ready to assist with any situations that might arise during the reception. Most importantly, she had prepared a short speech that would be delivered at a specific moment during the evening, a speech that would change the trajectory of the celebration and demonstrate the difference between justice and revenge. The morning of Emma's wedding dawned clear and bright, with just enough breeze to keep the temperature comfortable and rustle the leaves on the oak trees surrounding Rosewood Manor. Margaret arrived early to oversee the final preparations, walking through the gardens where the ceremony would take place and inspecting the reception hall where dinner and dancing would continue into the evening. Everything looked perfect, from the white chairs arranged in precise rows to the floral arrangements that complemented Emma's color scheme of sage green and cream. Margaret dressed carefully for her dual role as mother of the bride and secret venue owner. She chose a navy blue dress with subtle silver accessories, Elegant enough for photographs, but practical enough for the behind-the-scenes work she might need to do. In her purse, she carried the manila envelope containing documents that would serve as her ammunition when the moment was right. She also carried a small silver locket containing a photo of Emma as a child, a reminder of everything she was fighting to protect. Emma looked radiant as she prepared for the ceremony, surrounded by her bridesmaids in the bridal suite that Margaret now knew contained furniture she had purchased and artwork she had selected. Emma's dress was even more beautiful than Margaret had remembered, and her joy was infectious as she shared stories about David and their plans for their honeymoon in Costa Rica. Margaret felt a deep satisfaction knowing that she had ensured this day would be perfect for her daughter, regardless of what challenges might arise. The guests began arriving for the 4 o'clock ceremony, and Margaret positioned herself where she could observe without being obvious about her surveillance. She watched Emma's college friends, David's family from California, and the small group of relatives and family friends who had known Emma since childhood. The atmosphere was warm and celebratory, exactly what Margaret had hoped for when she first imagined her daughter's wedding day. Richard arrived fashionably late, making an entrance that seemed calculated to draw attention. He wore an expensive charcoal suit with a pocket square that matched Sophia's emerald dress, and he moved through the crowd with the confidence of someone who assumed his presence was welcome and important. Sophia clung to his arm with a bright smile that seemed designed to demonstrate her comfort and belonging at this family event. Margaret watched several guests notice Richard and Sophia's arrival with expressions ranging from surprise to discomfort. Emma's college friends, who knew the history of her parents' divorce, exchanged meaningful looks. David's parents, who were meeting Richard for the first time, seemed confused by the presence of a woman who was clearly not Emma's mother. Margaret felt a surge of protective anger as she realized that Richard's decision to bring Sophia was creating exactly the kind of social awkwardness and family tension that Emma had hoped to avoid. The ceremony itself was beautiful and proceeded without incident. Emma and David exchanged vows they had written themselves, promising to support each other's dreams and build a life based on mutual respect and shared values. Margaret cried during the ring exchange, overwhelmed by pride for her daughter and grief for the family unity that Richard's choices had destroyed. She noticed that Richard and Sophia sat in the second row rather than the front row typically reserved for immediate family, a small gesture of sensitivity that surprised Margaret until she realized it was probably Emma's decision rather than Richard's. After the ceremony, guests moved to the cocktail hour in the gardens, while the reception hall was prepared for dinner. Margaret mingled with the crowd, accepting congratulations and compliments about Emma's beauty and happiness. She kept a careful eye on Richard and Sophia, noting their interactions with other guests and waiting for the right moment to implement her plan. The moment came during the dinner service when Richard approached the microphone to give his father of the bride speech. Margaret had been expecting this, knowing that Richard never missed an opportunity to position himself as the center of attention at important events. She watched him clear his throat and begin speaking about Emma's childhood, his pride in her accomplishments, and his hopes for her future with David. As Richard continued his speech, Margaret made her way quietly to the back of the reception hall, where Linda, the event coordinator, was waiting with the envelope Margaret had prepared. Margaret nodded, and Linda handed her the microphone that was connected to the venue's sound system. Margaret took a deep breath, looked around the room at the faces of people who had known her family for years, and began to speak. The words she had practiced came easily, beginning with gratitude for everyone who had come to celebrate Emma and David, and acknowledgement of the joy and love that filled the beautiful venue. She paused, allowing the room to settle into complete attention, before continuing with the announcement that would change everything about the evening and demonstrate the difference between appearing powerful and actually being powerful.
Richard's voice carried across the room despite his attempt to maintain a conversational tone. This is Emma's wedding day, not the appropriate time for whatever point you're trying to make. Margaret turned to face him directly, maintaining her calm demeanor while feeling a surge of satisfaction at his obvious discomfort. I'm ensuring that Emma's wedding day proceeds smoothly and that all guests understand the expectations for respectful behavior. As the venue owner, I have both the authority and responsibility to address any situations that might compromise the celebration. The guests were now openly watching this exchange with the fascination of people witnessing a dramatic performance they had not expected to attend. Emma looked mortified, her face pale above the neckline of her beautiful dress, while David reached for her hand in a gesture of support and solidarity that Margaret found both touching and reassuring. Sophia seemed frozen in place, her emerald dress suddenly seeming too bright and attention-grabbing for the increasingly tense atmosphere. Margaret noticed that several guests were now looking directly at Sophia, with expressions ranging from curiosity to judgment, as if seeing her clearly for the first time and recognizing her role in the family dynamics that were playing out in real time. Furthermore, Margaret continued, returning her attention to the microphone and the broader audience, I want to address the financial arrangements for tonight's celebration. During the planning process, there was some confusion about payment schedules and final balances. As of this morning, all outstanding amounts have been settled in full, ensuring that Emma and David's celebration can proceed without any concerns about vendor payments or contractual obligations. This statement landed with particular impact because several guests, including Richard's professional colleagues, understood the implication that he had failed to meet his financial commitments for his own daughter's wedding. Margaret watched Richard's face darken further as he realized that she had not only purchased the venue, but had also discovered and resolved his payment delinquencies. Richard, Margaret said, addressing him directly while still speaking into the microphone so that her words carried to every corner of the reception hall. I believe you mentioned to several people that you were handling the venue costs as your contribution to Emma's celebration. I'm sure everyone here appreciates your generous intentions, and I want to assure you that the financial burden has been lifted from your shoulders. The phrase generous intentions was delivered with just enough emphasis to make clear that the reality had fallen short of the promise, a subtle but devastating critique that would be understood by anyone familiar with Richard's tendency to make grand gestures that he couldn't or wouldn't follow through on completely. Richard took several steps toward the front of the room, his professional training as a litigator clearly warring with his personal frustration as he tried to regain control of the situation. I think we should discuss this privately, Margaret. Our guests don't need to be involved in family financial matters. Actually, Margaret replied, her voice remaining remarkably steady, I think transparency is exactly what this situation requires. For too many years, I allowed important conversations to happen behind closed doors, where manipulation and misrepresentation could flourish without witnesses or accountability. Tonight, in my venue, we're going to handle things differently. She turned back to address the room more broadly, her posture confident and her tone shifting towards something more conversational but no less pointed. I want to share with all of you what I've learned about the importance of documentation, clear communication, and maintaining appropriate boundaries in both personal and professional relationships. Margaret reached into her purse and withdrew the manila envelope she had been carrying, opening it to reveal several sheets of paper that she held up so the guests could see them even if they couldn't read the specific content. These documents represent various agreements and understandings that have been put in place to ensure that tonight's celebration proceeds smoothly and that all parties understand their roles and responsibilities. Richard's attorney instincts seemed to kick in as he realized that Margaret was not simply making emotional statements, but was backing up her words with legal documentation. Margaret, whatever you think you're accomplishing here, I strongly advise you to reconsider. You're creating a public spectacle that Emma will remember for the rest of her life. You're absolutely right that Emma will remember this for the rest of her life, Margaret agreed, her voice taking on a warmer tone as she looked toward her daughter. I hope she'll remember that when someone attempts to manipulate or disrespect her, she has the right to stand up for herself with confidence and clarity. I hope she'll remember that financial independence gives you choices that dependency never can, and I hope she'll remember that sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are the ones who need the clearest boundaries. Emma stood up slowly, her wedding dress rustling softly as she moved. Her face showed a complex mixture of emotions, embarrassment, concern, confusion, but also something that might have been relief or even admiration. "Mom," she said quietly, but her voice carried in the hushed room, "I had no idea you bought the venue." "I wanted it to be a surprise," Margaret replied, her voice softening as she spoke directly to her daughter. "I wanted to ensure that your special day would be perfect and that no one would be able to create drama or complications that might spoil your celebration. I also wanted to demonstrate that your mother is not the powerless, passive person that some people might have assumed." David stood as well, placing his arm around Emma's waist in a gesture of support that Margaret found reassuring. "Mrs. Sinclair," he said, using the formal address that he had maintained throughout their relationship despite her invitations to call her Margaret, "Emma and I are grateful for everything you've done to make today beautiful. If there are issues that need to be addressed, we trust your judgment about how to handle them." This show of support from her new son-in-law seemed to give Margaret additional confidence, and she nodded gratefully toward David before returning her attention to the documents in her hands. The first document I want to share with you establishes the guest guidelines for Rosewood Manor, which all event hosts must acknowledge and accept as part of their rental agreement. She cleared her throat and began reading from what appeared to be an official contract. "All guests are expected to conduct themselves with dignity and respect for the celebration, the venue, and other attendees. Any behavior that creates discomfort, embarrassment, or distress for the bride and groom or their immediate family members may result in removal from the premises at the discretion of the venue owner." Richard's face grew even redder as he seemed to realize that Margaret was essentially reading him a formal warning about his behavior and Sophia's presence. "This is ridiculous, Margaret. You can't just make up rules and apply them retroactively to suit your personal agenda." "Actually," Margaret replied, calmly, "as the property owner, I have considerable discretion about establishing and enforcing behavioral expectations. These guidelines were developed in consultation with my attorney and are entirely within my legal rights to implement." She looked up from the document to scan the room, noting that many guests were now following the exchange with the rapt attention of people watching a dramatic performance. The second document addresses the specific situation we find ourselves in tonight, where a guest has brought a date whose presence creates obvious discomfort and social awkwardness for the bride's family. Sophia, who had been sitting in increasingly uncomfortable silence, finally spoke up. "Excuse me, but I don't think it's appropriate for you to discuss me as if I'm not here."
Richard and I have been together for over 2 years, and we have every right to attend social events as a couple. Margaret turned toward Sophia with an expression of polite interest, as if she were hearing this perspective for the first time. "You're absolutely correct that you have rights in general social situations. However, this is not a general social situation. This is a private event at a privately owned venue, and attendance is by invitation only." She paused to let this distinction sink in before continuing. "Emma extended an invitation to her father because she wanted him to be part of her celebration despite the pain his choices have caused our family. However, I don't believe Emma ever specifically invited you, Sophia. In fact, I believe Richard simply informed Emma that you would be accompanying him, presenting it as a fait accompli rather than a request subject to Emma's approval." Emma's face flushed as this interpretation of events was laid out so clearly. Margaret could see that her daughter was remembering the conversation with Richard where he had indeed presented Sophia's attendance as a given, rather than asking Emma's permission, or even her preference. "The invitation protocol matters," Margaret continued, "because it reflects respect for the bride and groom's wishes, rather than simply imposing your own desires on their celebration. When you attend someone's wedding as an uninvited guest, you create a situation where the hosts must choose between creating conflict by asking you to leave or accepting the discomfort of your presence." Richard stepped forward again, his voice rising slightly despite his obvious attempt to maintain composure. "Sophia is my partner, and she has every right to accompany me to family events. Emma is an adult who needs to accept that I've moved on with my life." "Moving on with your life is certainly your prerogative," Margaret agreed. "However, bringing your mistress to your daughter's wedding demonstrates either remarkably poor judgment or a deliberate desire to cause discomfort and assert dominance over a situation where sensitivity and discretion would be more appropriate."
The word mistress hung in the air like a challenge, stripping away the polite pretense that Sophia was simply Richard's new girlfriend rather than the woman who had participated in destroying his marriage. Margaret watched Sophia flinch at the term, apparently not accustomed to having her role described so bluntly in public. "I am not a mistress," Sophia said, her voice shaking slightly with either anger or embarrassment. "Richard and I met after his marriage was already over. I didn't break up anyone's marriage." Margaret tilted her head thoughtfully, as if considering this claim with genuine interest. The timeline is certainly interesting to examine. Based on credit card records that were discovered during our divorce proceedings, Richard's relationship with you began approximately 8 months before he informed me that our marriage was ending. The expensive dinners, weekend trips, and jewelry purchases were documented quite thoroughly by his financial records. She reached into her envelope again and withdrew what appeared to be copies of credit card statements. "I have documentation showing charges at restaurants where you worked, hotels and locations where you posted social media photos, and purchases at jewelry stores for items that I can see you wearing in photographs from that time period." Sophia's face went pale as she realized that Margaret had come prepared with specific evidence rather than simply making accusations based on suspicion or emotion. Richard moved closer to Sophia, placing his hand on her shoulder in a gesture that seemed more protective than romantic. "Even setting aside the timeline questions," Margaret continued, "the decision to bring you to Emma's wedding suggests a fundamental misunderstanding of appropriate social boundaries. Regardless of how long you've been together or what your future plans might be, today is about Emma and David, not about Richard's desire to showcase his new relationship." David cleared his throat softly, drawing attention back to himself and Emma. "I think what might be most helpful right now is focusing on what would make Emma most comfortable for the rest of the evening." Emma looked around the room at the faces watching her with expressions ranging from sympathy to curiosity to obvious discomfort. Margaret could see her daughter struggling with the competing desires to avoid further conflict and to assert her own preferences about her wedding celebration. "I appreciate everyone's concern for my feelings," Emma said carefully, her voice gaining strength as she continued. "The truth is that I was uncomfortable when Dad told me he was bringing Sophia, but I didn't know how to object without seeming petty or creating family drama." She paused, looking directly at Richard with an expression that reminded Margaret of Emma as a child when she was gathering courage to tell the truth about something difficult. "I wanted you at my wedding, Dad, because you're my father, and I love you despite everything that's happened. But I never wanted Sophia here, and I felt like you didn't give me a choice about it." Richard's expression softened slightly as he seemed to realize that his daughter was not simply being influenced by Margaret's hostility, but was expressing her own genuine feelings about the situation. "Emma, I thought you understood that Sophia is an important part of my life now. I didn't want to hide that relationship or pretend it doesn't exist." "I'm not asking you to hide your relationship," Emma replied, her voice gaining confidence. "I'm asking you to recognize that my wedding day is not the appropriate place to make statements about your personal life. This day is supposed to be about David and me, not about proving points or forcing acceptance of decisions that hurt our family." Margaret felt a surge of pride watching Emma articulate her boundaries with such clarity and maturity. This was exactly what she had hoped to achieve by creating a situation where honest conversation could happen without the usual patterns of manipulation and avoidance that had characterized their family dynamics for years. "The third document in my envelope," Margaret said, "addresses the financial irregularities that have come to light during the wedding planning process. Richard, you committed to paying for the venue as your contribution to Emma's celebration, but your payments were both irregular and insufficient." She held up what appeared to be copies of invoices and payment records. "The total amount owed was substantial, and the final payment deadline was last Friday. When that deadline passed without payment, the standard protocol would have been to cancel the event." Richard's face flushed again as he realized that Margaret was publicly documenting his failure to meet his financial commitments. "There were some temporary cash flow issues with my practice. I was working out a payment plan with the venue coordinator."
Actually, Margaret corrected, you were attempting to negotiate additional payment extensions without providing any realistic timeline for settlement. Linda, our event coordinator, documented several conversations where you suggested that your professional reputation should be sufficient guarantee for delayed payment. She turned to address the room more broadly.
This pattern of making commitments without follow-through, then relying on charm and professional status to avoid consequences, represents exactly the kind of behavior that makes clear boundaries and documentation necessary. Linda, the event coordinator, had been standing quietly near the back of the room throughout this exchange, clearly uncomfortable with being drawn into what had become a very public family confrontation. Margaret gestured toward her with a reassuring smile. Linda has been wonderful throughout this process, and I want to make clear that she handled Richard's payment delays with extraordinary patience and professionalism. The resolution came when I settled the full outstanding balance myself, ensuring that Emma's celebration could proceed without any financial complications. Richard seemed to realize that his credibility and reputation were being systematically dismantled in front of his professional colleagues and Emma's wedding guests. I was prepared to handle the financial obligations. The timing of certain client payments created temporary complications, but the situation would have been resolved. Perhaps, Margaret acknowledged, but Emma's wedding date couldn't be postponed to accommodate uncertain client payments. As a mother, I wasn't willing to risk my daughter's celebration being canceled due to financial instability. She returned the documents to her envelope with deliberate care, as if she were concluding a business presentation rather than confronting her ex-husband at their daughter's wedding. The final document establishes my expectations for the remainder of this evening and any future family events. Margaret's voice took on a more formal tone as she addressed these concluding points. Richard, you are welcome to remain for the rest of Emma's reception because your daughter wants you here. However, your attendance is contingent on respectful behavior that prioritizes Emma and David's comfort over your own desires to make statements or assert authority. She turned toward Sophia with an expression that was polite but unmistakably firm. Sophia, I'm asking you to leave. Your presence here creates discomfort for Emma, awkwardness for the other guests, and serves no purpose beyond satisfying Richard's desire to normalize a relationship that began under circumstances that hurt our family deeply. Sophia looked toward Richard as if expecting him to defend her right to stay or to leave with her in solidarity. Richard's face showed the internal conflict between his desire to support Sophia and his recognition that staying for the remainder of Emma's wedding was more important to his relationship with his daughter. "This is completely unreasonable," Sophia said, her voice rising with frustration. "I've done anything wrong here tonight. I've been polite and respectful, and I haven't caused any problems." "You're correct that your behavior tonight has been appropriate," Margaret acknowledged. "However, your mere presence represents a problem that goes beyond your individual actions. You are a living reminder of choices that caused significant pain to Emma and me, and asking us to celebrate alongside you demonstrates a fundamental lack of empathy and social awareness." Emma spoke up again, her voice quiet but clear. "Sophia, I don't hate you personally, but Mom is right that having you here makes the stay more difficult for me. I hope you can understand that my wedding isn't the right place to work through complicated family feelings." David nodded in agreement with his new wife. "We'd really appreciate having the rest of the evening focused on celebration rather than navigating family tensions that don't need to be addressed today." Sophia looked around the room at faces that ranged from sympathetic to openly critical, clearly realizing that public opinion was not aligning in her favor. Richard's professional colleagues seemed particularly uncomfortable, apparently recognizing that they were witnessing behavior that reflected poorly on Richard's judgment and character. "Fine," Sophia said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "I can see that I'm not welcome here. Richard, I'll wait for you at the hotel." Richard's face showed genuine distress as he realized he was being forced to choose between supporting Sophia and remaining for his daughter's celebration. "Sophia, wait. Let me talk to Emma privately and see if we can work something out." "No, Dad," Emma said firmly. "There's nothing to work out. This is my decision, and I'm asking Sophia to leave. If you choose to go with her, I'll be disappointed, but I'll understand. If you choose to stay, you need to accept that this is what I want for my wedding day." Margaret watched this exchange with deep satisfaction, recognizing that Emma was demonstrating exactly the kind of clear boundary setting that Margaret had hoped to model. Her daughter was not being cruel or vindictive, but she was being direct about her needs and expectations. Richard stood in silence for several long moments, clearly struggling with a decision that would have significant implications for both his relationship with Sophia and his relationship with Emma. "I'll stay for the rest of the reception," Richard said finally. "Sophia, I'll call you later and we'll talk about this." Sophia's face showed hurt and anger in equal measure as she realized that Richard was choosing Emma over her, at least for this evening. "I hope you enjoy your celebration," she said, the words polite but delivered with unmistakable bitterness. "I'll remember that family apparently means whatever is most convenient for everyone else." She gathered her small purse and moved toward the exit with as much dignity as she could manage, her emerald dress now seeming more like costume than celebration attire. Several guests watched her departure with obvious relief, and Margaret noticed that the tension in the room seemed to dissipate noticeably once Sophia was no longer present. Richard remained standing near the head table, looking somewhat lost without Sophia beside him, and clearly uncertain about how to proceed with the rest of the evening. Margaret approached him with her empty envelope, her earlier anger having transformed into something more like professional satisfaction at a successful negotiation. "Thank you for making the right choice," Margaret said quietly, speaking just to Richard rather than addressing the room. "Emma needed to know that she matters more to you than your desire to prove points about your personal life." Richard looked at her with an expression that was difficult to read, containing elements of anger, grudging respect, and perhaps even relief that the confrontation was over. "You planned all of this, didn't you? The venue purchase, the timing of the announcement, even having documentation ready." "I plan to protect my daughter and myself from further manipulation," Margaret replied. "Tonight was always going to be challenging because of your choices about Sophia. I simply ensured that I would be in a position of strength rather than hoping for your consideration or empathy." She gestured toward the guests who were beginning to resume their conversations and return attention to their dinner courses. "The rest of the evening can proceed normally if you're willing to focus on celebrating Emma and David rather than processing your feelings about what just happened." Richard nodded slowly, seeming to recognize that continuing to fight would only create more problems for Emma's celebration. "I suppose I underestimated you. Again." "The mistake you keep making," Margaret said with a slight smile, "is assuming that kindness equals weakness and that patience equals passivity. Tonight you learned the difference between someone who chooses not to fight and someone who is simply waiting for the right battlefield." She turned to return the microphone to Linda and to signal that the formal portion of her presentation was complete. The reception could now continue with the planned schedule of dinner, speeches, and dancing, but the power dynamics that had shaped their family for years had been fundamentally altered in ways that would influence every future interaction. The dinner service resumed with an almost surreal normalcy, as if the previous 30 minutes of public confrontation had been an intermission in a play rather than a fundamental restructuring of family relationships. Margaret moved through the reception hall with quiet confidence, checking on guests and ensuring that the catering staff maintained their impeccable service despite the drama they had witnessed. She noticed that conversations had become more animated rather than less, as if the honesty and directness of the confrontation had freed people from the polite pretense that usually characterized wedding receptions. Emma and David seemed to settle into their roles as newlyweds with renewed joy, no longer carrying the subtle tension that had marked the earlier portion of the evening when Sophia's presence created an undercurrent of family awkwardness. Margaret watched her daughter laugh at something David whispered in her ear and felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond the strategic victory she had just achieved. Emma looked genuinely happy for the first time all day, as if a weight had been lifted that she hadn't fully realized she was carrying. Richard remained at his assigned table, making polite conversation with the other guests, but clearly processing the implications of what had transpired. Margaret observed him throughout the evening with the detached interest of someone studying a specimen rather than the emotional investment of someone still connected to his choices and reactions. She noticed that several of his professional colleagues seemed to be treating him with subtle but noticeable coolness, apparently reassessing their opinions of his character based on the financial and personal details that had been revealed during the confrontation. The string quartet transitioned into music for dancing, and Margaret found herself genuinely enjoying the celebration for the first time since the planning process began. She danced with David's father, a kind man who seemed genuinely pleased to welcome Emma into their family, and she chatted with Emma's college friends, who expressed both surprise and admiration for the way she had handled the difficult situation. Several women approached her privately to share their own stories of divorce, manipulation, and the challenges of establishing boundaries with ex-husbands who refused to accept changed circumstances. One conversation particularly moved Margaret. A woman named Patricia, who had been Emma's roommate during sophomore year, pulled Margaret aside near the dessert table and spoke quietly about her own struggles with an ex-husband who continued to create drama and chaos in her life despite their divorce being finalized years earlier. "I wish I had your courage," Patricia said, her voice barely audible above the music. "Watching you tonight made me realize how much I've been accepting behavior that I don't have to accept. You didn't just stand up for yourself, you did it with such dignity and preparation. It was like watching someone demonstrate that you can be strong without being cruel." Margaret felt touched by this recognition of her intentions. Throughout the planning and execution of her confrontation with Richard, she had been careful to maintain her integrity while asserting her boundaries. The goal had never been to humiliate Richard or create a scene for its own sake, but rather to establish clear expectations and demonstrate that manipulation would no longer be tolerated. "The key is documentation and financial independence," Margaret replied quietly. "When you have both legal standing and economic power, you can make choices based on your values rather than your fears. It took me 3 years to build that foundation, but tonight proved it was worth every sacrifice and every hour of extra work." As the evening progressed, Margaret noticed that Richard made several attempts to engage Emma in private conversation, apparently hoping to address the situation away from the public scrutiny that had characterized their earlier exchange. Emma handled these overturns with the same mature directness she had shown during the confrontation, agreeing to speak with him, but maintaining clear boundaries about the scope and tone of their discussion. Margaret positioned herself where she could observe these interactions without obviously eavesdropping, wanting to ensure that Richard didn't attempt to manipulate Emma or make her feel guilty for the choices that had been made. She was pleased to see that Emma maintained her composure and seemed to be expressing her own thoughts and feelings rather than simply trying to manage Richard's emotions or avoid further conflict. The conversation between Emma and Richard lasted approximately 15 minutes and ended with what appeared to be a civil but firm understanding between them. Emma returned to the reception with a relieved expression, while Richard seemed subdued but not angry. Margaret interpreted this as a positive outcome, suggesting that Richard had accepted Emma's position rather than attempting to argue or negotiate for different terms. Later that evening, as the reception wound down and guests began to depart, Emma approached Margaret with a complex expression that combined gratitude, concern, and curiosity. They found a quiet corner near the gardens where the ceremony had taken place earlier, away from the remaining guests who were saying their goodbyes and collecting wedding favors from the elegantly arranged table near the exit. "Mom, I need to understand what tonight was really about," Emma said. "I'm grateful that you stood up for me and that you made it possible for me to have my wedding day without the stress of Dad's financial problems. But I also need to know what this means for our family going forward." Margaret had been anticipating this conversation and had spent considerable time thinking about how to explain her actions in a way that Emma could understand and accept. She wanted to be honest about her motivations while also reassuring her that the confrontation had been about establishing boundaries rather than seeking revenge or creating ongoing conflict. "The venue purchase was a business decision that happened to provide me with leverage in a difficult family situation," Margaret began carefully.
"I've been looking for investment opportunities since the divorce, and Rosewood Manor represented both a solid financial opportunity and a way to ensure that your wedding day would be perfect regardless of what challenges might arise." She paused to study Emma's face, trying to gauge her daughter's reaction to this explanation. "The confrontation with your father and Sophia was about demonstrating that I will no longer accept manipulation or disrespect, either toward myself or toward you. I wanted you to see that you have the right to set boundaries and expect them to be honored, even by people who claim to love you." Emma nodded thoughtfully, seeming to process both the practical and emotional dimensions of Margaret's choices. "I understand why you felt you had to do something about the Sophia situation. It really was bothering me more than I wanted to admit,
and I didn't know how to handle it without seeming petty or vindictive. You're not responsible for managing other people's inappropriate choices, Margaret replied firmly. Your father put you in an impossible position by bringing Sophia without asking your permission, and then expecting you to handle the discomfort gracefully while he avoided taking responsibility for the situation he created. Emma smiled slightly, an expression that reminded Margaret of her daughter as a child when she was working through a complex problem with characteristic thoroughness. The financial part is harder for me to understand. I knew Dad was having some issues with the venue payments, but I didn't realize how serious it had become. Margaret felt a moment of regret about exposing Richard's financial failures so publicly, but she reminded herself that Emma deserved to understand the full context of the situation. Your father has a pattern of making commitments he can't keep, and then relying on charm or professional status to avoid consequences. Tonight was about demonstrating that this pattern won't work when dealing with me anymore. Will you and Dad be able to have a civil relationship going forward? Emma asked, her concern evident in her voice. I don't want my relationship with either of you to become more complicated because of what happened tonight. Margaret considered this question carefully, recognizing that Emma's ongoing relationship with Richard was important and that her own actions should support rather than undermine that connection. Your father and I will interact when necessary for family events or matters related to you, but our relationship will be strictly businesslike rather than the more personal dynamic we've maintained since the divorce. She reached for Emma's hand, wanting to provide reassurance about this fundamental shift in family dynamics. This actually makes things simpler and clearer rather than more complicated. There won't be any more confusion about expectations or boundaries because everything will be explicit and documented rather than assumed or implied. Emma squeezed Margaret's hand in response, seeming to find comfort in this explanation. I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself, even though it was uncomfortable to watch. I think I needed to see that it's possible to be strong and direct without being mean or vindictive. That distinction is crucial, Margaret agreed. Strength isn't about hurting other people or seeking revenge. It's about protecting yourself and the people you care about by establishing clear boundaries and maintaining them consistently. As they walked back toward the reception hall to help with the final cleanup and guest departures, Margaret felt a profound sense of completion that went beyond the satisfaction of a successful confrontation. She had demonstrated to herself, to Emma, and to Richard that she was no longer the passive, accommodating woman who had accepted manipulation and disrespect for the sake of avoiding conflict. The cleanup process provided an opportunity for Margaret to observe the dynamics between the venue staff and to begin thinking practically about her new role as a business owner. Linda, the event coordinator, approached her with obvious relief and gratitude about how the evening had concluded despite the dramatic middle portion. Mrs. Sinclair, I want you to know that the way you handled that situation tonight was both professional and appropriate, Linda said quietly. In 15 years of coordinating weddings, I've seen family drama create much worse problems, and I've never seen someone address it so directly while maintaining dignity for everyone involved. Margaret felt pleased by this professional validation of her approach. Thank you, Linda. I hope we can work together effectively as I transition into my new role as owner. Your experience and expertise will be invaluable as I learn the details of running this business. Linda's expression brightened considerably at this indication that her job security was assured under the new ownership. I'm excited about working with you. There are several opportunities for growth and improvement that the previous owners weren't interested in pursuing, and I think your background in real estate will bring valuable perspective to our operations. Over the following weeks, Margaret threw herself into learning every aspect of the event venue business with the same intensity she had brought to real estate after her divorce. She met with vendors, reviewed contracts, studied financial records, and walked through the property with maintenance staff to understand the ongoing needs of the buildings and grounds. The learning curve was steep but manageable, and she found herself energized by the challenge of mastering a new professional domain. The transition also provided natural opportunities to establish new routines and social connections that were entirely separate from her previous life with Richard. She joined the local Chamber of Commerce, attended networking events for small business owners, and began developing relationships with other wedding vendors who could provide referrals and collaborative opportunities. One of her most satisfying early projects was updating the venue's marketing materials and website to reflect a more modern and sophisticated brand identity. Margaret hired a professional photographer to capture the property's best features and worked with a graphic designer to create promotional materials that emphasized the venue's historic character while highlighting its contemporary amenities and services. The business aspects of venue ownership proved to be both challenging and rewarding in ways that Margaret had not fully anticipated. She discovered that she enjoyed the problem-solving required to coordinate complex events, the relationship building involved in working with anxious brides and their families, and the creative satisfaction of helping people design celebrations that reflected their personality and values. More importantly, the financial success of Rosewood Manor provided Margaret with a level of economic security and independence that she had never experienced during her marriage or in the immediate aftermath of her divorce. Within 6 months of purchasing the venue, she was able to pay off her apartment mortgage entirely and begin building substantial savings for the first time in her adult life. The personal transformation was equally significant. Margaret found that owning and operating her own business changed how she interacted with people in all areas of her life. She became more direct in her communication, more confident in her decision-making, and more willing to trust her own judgment about people and situations. This newfound confidence was tested during the holiday season, when Richard attempted to re-establish more frequent contact under the pretense of coordinating Christmas plans with Emma.
Margaret recognized his overtures as an attempt to return to previous patterns of interaction, where she would accommodate his preferences and work around his schedule rather than maintaining the clear boundaries she had established. Their first post-wedding conversation took place over the phone in late November, when Richard called to discuss Emma and David's plans for Christmas dinner. Margaret listened to his assumptions about joint family celebrations and shared hosting responsibilities with the detached interest of someone observing behavior that no longer had the power to manipulate her decisions. "Richard, I think there's been a misunderstanding about how holiday arrangements will work going forward," Margaret said calmly when he paused in his planning monologue. "Emma and David are adults who can make their own decisions about how to spend their time. If they choose to see both of us during the holidays, that's wonderful, but we won't be coordinating our plans or hosting joint celebrations." Richard's response revealed that he had not fully processed the permanent nature of the changes that had occurred at Emma's wedding. "Margaret, I think you're being unnecessarily rigid about this. We managed to get through Emma's wedding without major problems, and I thought we could build on that progress for future family events." "We got through Emma's wedding because I took control of the situation and established clear expectations," Margaret corrected. "That worked because everyone understood their roles and boundaries. Joint holiday planning would require a level of cooperation and compromise that isn't realistic given our history and current relationship." Richard's response revealed that he had not fully processed the permanent nature of the changes that had occurred at Emma's wedding. "Margaret, I think you're being unnecessarily rigid about this. We managed to get through Emma's wedding without major problems, and I thought we could build on that progress for future family events." "We got through Emma's wedding because I took control of the situation and established clear expectations," Margaret corrected. "That worked because everyone understood their roles and boundaries. Joint holiday planning would require a level of cooperation and compromise that isn't realistic given our history and current relationship." Richard's voice took on the persuasive tone that Margaret recognized from their marriage, when he was trying to convince her to accept arrangements that primarily served his convenience. "I think you're still processing anger about the divorce and the situation with Sophia. Maybe with more time, you'll be able to approach family events with less emotional baggage." Margaret felt a moment of familiar frustration at Richard's ability to characterize her boundaries as emotional dysfunction, rather than rational responses to his behavior. However, she also felt gratified by how clearly she could now see through this manipulation technique and how little power it had to influence her decisions. "My emotional processing is complete," Margaret replied with professional courtesy. "My current approach to family interactions is based on practical considerations rather than unresolved feelings. I prefer arrangements that are clear, documented, and don't require ongoing negotiation or compromise."
The conversation ended with Richard expressing disappointment about her unwillingness to be more flexible, but Margaret felt only relief about having maintained her position without being drawn into lengthy explanations or justifications. This interaction confirmed her belief that the new boundaries she had established were both necessary and sustainable. Christmas arrangements ultimately worked out smoothly, with Emma and David visiting Margaret for Christmas Eve dinner and spending Christmas Day with Richard, an arrangement that provided everyone with family time while avoiding the complications and tensions that joint celebrations would have created. Margaret hosted a small but elegant dinner party for Emma, David, and David's parents, who were visiting from California, creating exactly the kind of warm, relaxed family atmosphere she had always preferred. The new year brought expanded opportunities for Rosewood Manor, as word spread about the venue's excellent management and beautiful facilities. Margaret received inquiries about corporate events, anniversary celebrations, and other special occasions beyond the wedding market that had been the previous owner's primary focus. She carefully evaluated each opportunity, accepting events that aligned with the venue's brand and capacity, while declining requests that would compromise the quality of service or create operational challenges. One particularly satisfying booking came from a nonprofit organization that supported women transitioning out of domestic violence situations. They wanted to host a fundraising gala that would recognize survivors and donors while raising money for emergency housing and legal services. Margaret offered the venue at a significantly reduced rate and worked with the organization to create an event that was both elegant and meaningful. The fundraising gala provided Margaret with an opportunity to share her own story of financial manipulation and recovery with an audience that understood the challenges of rebuilding life after abuse. She gave a brief speech about the importance of economic independence and strategic planning, emphasizing that leaving an abusive situation often required months or years of careful preparation rather than spontaneous departure. "The most important lesson I learned," Margaret told the audience of survivors, donors, and service providers, "is that you can't rely on other people's sense of fairness or decency to protect you from exploitation. You have to build your own power through financial independence, legal documentation, and clear boundaries that you're prepared to enforce." The response to her speech was overwhelmingly positive, with several women approaching her afterward to ask for advice about real estate investments, business ownership, and strategies for building economic security. Margaret found these conversations deeply fulfilling, recognizing that her experiences could provide valuable guidance for other women navigating similar challenges. These interactions also led to new business opportunities, as Margaret began offering workshops for divorced women about financial planning and property investment. She partnered with local attorneys and financial advisors to provide comprehensive education about protecting assets, building credit, and making strategic investments that could provide long-term security and independence. The workshop program grew organically through word-of-mouth referrals and partnerships with women's organizations, domestic violence agencies, and divorce support groups. Margaret discovered that she had a natural talent for teaching complex financial concepts in accessible ways and for providing emotional support alongside practical guidance. 1 year after Emma's wedding, Margaret received an unexpected phone call from Sophia, who requested a private meeting to discuss what she described as important family matters. Margaret's initial instinct was to decline this request, but her curiosity about Sophia's motivations led her to agree to a brief coffee meeting at a neutral location. Sophia arrived at the coffee shop looking significantly different from the confident, polished woman who attended Emma's wedding. She appeared tired and stressed, with dark circles under her eyes and clothing that suggested financial constraints rather than the expensive tastes Margaret remembered from their previous encounter. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me," Sophia began, her voice subdued and lacking the defiant tone that had characterized her interactions at the wedding. "I wanted to apologize for my behavior that night and to explain some things about my relationship with Richard that I think you deserve to understand." Margaret listened with polite attention, curious about what had motivated Sophia to reach out and what revelations she might be preparing to share. The apology seemed genuine rather than strategic, suggesting that Sophia had experienced some form of personal reckoning about her choices and their consequences. "Richard and I broke up 3 months ago," Sophia continued, her voice becoming even quieter. "The relationship ended when I discovered that he had been having an affair with another paralegal at his firm, someone even younger than me.
When I confronted him about it, he told me that I was being hypocritical given how our relationship had started. Margaret felt a moment of vindication at this confirmation of Richard's character, but also some sympathy for Sophia's obvious pain and disillusionment. The pattern of behavior was entirely consistent with what Margaret had observed during their marriage, where Richard's need for excitement and validation seemed to require constant novelty and conquest. "I'm sorry you had to learn about Richard's character in such a painful way," I said sincerely. "But I'm curious about why you wanted to share this information with me specifically." Sophia's face flushed with what appeared to be shame or embarrassment. "Because I realized that everything you said at Emma's wedding was true. I was Richard's mistress, even though I tried to convince myself otherwise."
I participated in destroying your marriage because I believed his stories about how unhappy he was and how the divorce was inevitable anyway. She paused to collect herself before continuing. After he left me for someone else, I started thinking about how I would feel if my husband brought his mistress to my daughter's wedding. I realized that what I did to you and Emma was cruel and selfish, and I wanted you to know that I understand that now. Margaret found herself genuinely moved by Sophia's honesty and apparent growth. The apology didn't undo the pain that Sophia's choices had caused, but it demonstrated a level of self-awareness and accountability that Margaret had not expected from someone who had seemed so focused on justifying her behavior. "I appreciate your apology and your honesty about what happened," Margaret replied. "I hope you've learned something about the importance of understanding your role in difficult situations rather than just focusing on your own feelings and desires." Sophia nodded earnestly. "I've learned a lot about consequences and responsibility. I also wanted you to know that Richard has been having financial problems that are much more serious than what came out at Emma's wedding. I think Emma should be aware that he might not be able to provide the kind of support she might expect from him in the future." This information aligned with Margaret's suspicions about Richard's financial stability, but she was surprised that Sophia would volunteer details that reflected poorly on Richard's character and reliability. The gesture suggested that Sophia's concerns about Emma's welfare were genuine, rather than motivated by desire for revenge against Richard. "What kind of financial problems are you referring to?" Margaret asked, recognizing that this information might be important for Emma's long-term planning and decision-making. Sophia hesitated before answering, as if weighing her loyalty to Richard against her responsibility to share important information. "He's been taking money from client trust accounts to cover personal expenses and business costs. I only found out because I was helping him with bookkeeping after his secretary quit. The amounts are substantial, and I don't think he has a plan for repaying them." Margaret felt a chill of concern about the legal and ethical implications of what Sophia was describing. Misuse of client funds was one of the most serious violations an attorney could commit, carrying consequences that included disbarment, criminal charges, and personal liability for the stolen amounts. "Have you reported this to the State Bar Association or any other regulatory authority?" Margaret asked, recognizing that Sophia might have legal obligations as well as ethical concerns about the situation. Sophia shook her head. "I left as soon as I found out about it, and I haven't had any contact with Richard since then. I don't know what my legal obligations are, but I felt like Emma should know that her father might be facing serious professional and legal problems." Margaret thanked Sophia for the information and promised to consider how best to handle the situation in Emma's interests. After Sophia left, Margaret sat in the coffee shop for another hour, thinking about the implications of what she had learned and what responsibilities she might have to warn Emma about potential complications with Richard's finances and legal status. That evening, Margaret called Emma to arrange a private conversation about Richard's situation. She was careful to present Sophia's information as unverified allegations rather than established facts, but she emphasized that Emma should be prepared for the possibility that Richard might face professional sanctions or legal charges that could affect his ability to provide financial support or maintain his law practice. Emma's response was mature and thoughtful, showing the kind of practical wisdom that made Margaret proud of the young woman her daughter had become. "I'm not surprised, honestly. Dad's always been careless with money and boundaries, and I've been wondering when that would catch up with him professionally."
The important thing is that you and David build your financial security independent of any assumptions about help or inheritance from your father, Margaret advised. Whatever legal problems he might face, you shouldn't let them affect your own planning and decision-making. Emma agreed with this approach, and they spent the remainder of their conversation discussing Emma's career development and her plans for building long-term financial stability with David. Margaret felt proud that her daughter had learned the lessons about independence and self-reliance that Margaret had worked so hard to model and teach. 6 months later, Margaret's concerns about Richard's professional conduct proved to be well-founded when he was formally disciplined by the State Bar Association for mishandling client funds. The sanctions included suspension of his law license, mandatory restitution to affected clients, and supervision of his practice if his license was eventually reinstated. Emma handled the news with remarkable composure, expressing disappointment in her father's choices but not surprise about the consequences he was facing. Margaret offered emotional support and practical assistance if needed, but Emma seemed to have processed the situation in healthy ways that didn't compromise her own stability or relationships. The scandal surrounding Richard's professional misconduct had minimal impact on Margaret's business or social connections, confirming her wisdom in establishing clear boundaries and independent identity after their divorce. Her reputation remained intact, and several people commented approvingly on her foresight in building financial independence that protected her from the consequences of Richard's poor judgment. 2 years after Emma's wedding, Margaret reflected on the profound changes in her life with deep satisfaction and gratitude. Rosewood Manor had become not just a successful business, but a source of personal fulfillment and professional identity that was entirely her own creation. The venue hosted over 80 events per year, employed a small but dedicated staff, and generated sufficient income to support Margaret's comfortable lifestyle while building substantial savings for future expansion or retirement. More importantly, the confidence and independence she had gained through confronting Richard and establishing her own business had transformed every aspect of her life. She made decisions based on her own values and preferences rather than trying to manage other people's reactions or expectations. She formed friendships and professional relationships based on mutual respect and shared interests, rather than obligation or convenience. Margaret's workshops for divorced women had evolved into a formal consulting practice that provided income while allowing her to help other women navigate the challenges of building independent lives after marriage ended. She had developed partnerships with attorneys, financial planners, and therapists who shared her commitment to helping women develop practical skills alongside emotional healing. The most rewarding aspect of her transformation was the relationship she had built with Emma, which had evolved from the complicated dynamics of mother managing family tensions to a genuine friendship between two strong, independent women who respect each other's choices and boundaries. Emma and David visited regularly, often bringing friends or colleagues who were planning their own celebrations and wanted to experience the venue's beautiful settings and excellent service. Margaret enjoyed these visits enormously, appreciating the opportunity to see her daughter thriving in her marriage and career while building the kind of life that reflected her own values and priorities. One evening in late spring, as Margaret walked through the gardens where Emma had been married 3 years earlier, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this place of contentment and strength. The confrontation at Emma's wedding had been a turning point, but it was only one moment in a longer process of reclaiming her power and rebuilding her life according to her own vision. The lavender she had planted along the garden paths filled the evening air with its soothing fragrance, and the sunset cast golden light across the property she now owned and managed with pride and competence.
Margaret felt profound gratitude for the courage she had found to challenge Richard's manipulation and for the opportunities that had emerged from that decision to stop accepting treatment that diminished her worth and dignity. Standing in the same spot where she had watched Emma exchange vows with David, Margaret understood that her own transformation had been a kind of marriage as well, a commitment to herself and to the belief that every person deserves relationships built on respect, honesty, and mutual support. The venue around her represented not just financial success, but proof that it was never too late to claim your own story and write a new chapter based on strength rather than accommodation. The evening was peaceful and beautiful, filled with the sounds of birds settling into the oak trees and the distant traffic from the highway that connected her property to the wider world.
Margaret felt entirely at home in this space she had created, surrounded by evidence of her own competence and vision, secure in the knowledge that she had built something lasting and valuable that no one could take away from her through manipulation or legal maneuvering. As darkness settled over Rosewood Manor, Margaret locked the main house and walked to her car with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had successfully navigated a complete life transformation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight she could rest in the knowledge that she had proven to herself and everyone around her that true strength comes not from controlling others, but from refusing to allow others to control you. 5 years had passed since that transformative wedding day, and Margaret stood in the same rose garden where her daughter had exchanged vows, but this time she was preparing for a different kind of celebration. Today marked the 5th anniversary of Rosewood Manor under her ownership, and she was hosting an appreciation event for the vendors, staff, and clients who had made the venue's success possible. The woman who had once measured her worth by how much she could sacrifice for others now moved through her property with the confidence of someone who had learned to define success on her own terms. Margaret wore a burgundy dress that she had chosen because she loved the color, not because it would please anyone else or meet someone else's expectations. Her silver hair, which she had stopped coloring 3 years earlier, caught the afternoon sunlight as she supervised the final preparations for the evening's festivities. The transformation in her physical appearance reflected deeper changes in how she approached every aspect of her life. Gone was the anxious energy of someone constantly trying to anticipate and manage other people's reactions. In its place was the calm authority of a business owner who had learned to trust her own judgment and make decisions based on clear analysis rather than emotional manipulation. Rosewood Manor had exceeded every expectation Margaret had held when she made the impulsive decision to purchase the venue. The business now hosted over 100 events per year, ranging from intimate anniversary celebrations to elaborate corporate gatherings. She had expanded the facilities to include a bridal suite with luxury amenities, updated the sound and lighting systems throughout the property, and established partnerships with premier vendors who shared her commitment to exceptional service. More significantly, the venue had become a model for other women-owned businesses in the events industry. Margaret regularly spoke at conferences about entrepreneurship, financial independence, and the strategic advantages of owning rather than renting the spaces where important life moments unfold. Her story had been featured in business magazines and wedding publications, not as a tale of revenge, but as an example of how adversity could become the foundation for unexpected success. The consulting practice she had developed alongside the venue operations had grown into a comprehensive program that helped women transition from economic dependence to financial autonomy. Margaret had written a guidebook that outlined practical steps for building assets, establishing credit, and creating multiple income streams that could provide security regardless of relationship status or family circumstances. Emma arrived early for the anniversary celebration, bringing David and their 6-month-old daughter, Grace, who had become the center of Margaret's personal universe in ways that surprised her with their intensity. Watching Emma navigate motherhood with the same thoughtful independence that characterized all her major decisions filled Margaret with pride that went beyond typical grandparent joy. "Mom, the gardens look absolutely incredible," Emma said as she adjusted Grace's sun hat and looked around the property with genuine admiration. "I can't believe how much you've expanded and improved everything in just 5 years." Margaret accepted the compliment with quiet satisfaction, recognizing that Emma's praise came from understanding the work and vision required to transform a struggling business into a thriving enterprise. The improvements happened gradually as the revenue allowed for reinvestment. The key was having a clear long-term plan and being patient about implementing it. David, who had become a successful architect specializing in sustainable design, nodded approvingly at the solar panels Margaret had installed on the carriage house roof and the native plant landscaping that reduced water consumption while creating year-round visual interest. "You've created something really special here. The combination of historic character and modern efficiency is exactly what the industry needs." As guests began arriving for the celebration, Margaret noticed how different this gathering felt from the wedding reception where she had confronted Richard and established her new boundaries. Tonight's event was entirely under her control, filled with people who respected her professional expertise and personal integrity.
There were no hidden agendas, no manipulative undercurrents, no need for defensive strategies or protective documentation. Linda, who had remained as event coordinator and had become Margaret's closest business partner, approached with a champagne glass and a warm smile. "Mrs. Sinclair, I wanted to thank you again for giving me the opportunity to grow with this business. Working with you has been the most rewarding professional experience of my career." Margaret appreciated Linda's loyalty and competence, recognizing that the venue's success depended on the team of dedicated professionals who shared her commitment to excellence. "Thank you, Linda. Your expertise and dedication have been essential to everything we've accomplished together." The evening proceeded with the smooth precision that had become Rosewood Manor's trademark. Guests enjoyed locally sourced appetizers and wines from regional vineyards, toured the updated facilities, and listened to brief presentations about the venue's expansion plans and community partnerships. Margaret felt deeply satisfied by the professional relationships she had cultivated and the reputation for integrity and quality that had become associated with her business. Near sunset, Margaret found herself in a quiet conversation with Dr. Sarah Chen, David's mother, who had become an unexpected friend and mentor over the years since Emma's wedding. Dr. Chen was a retired economics professor who had built her own successful consulting practice, and she understood the challenges and rewards of late-in-life entrepreneurship. "I've been thinking about the courage it took for you to buy this place," Dr. Chen said, as they watched Grace play with colorful blocks on a blanket in the garden. "Most people your age would have chosen security over opportunity, but you risked everything to build something new." Margaret considered this observation thoughtfully. "I think the risk of staying the same felt greater than the risk of changing. After my divorce, I realized that financial dependence and emotional accommodation had left me vulnerable to manipulation that I couldn't control. Owning this business gave me agency that I had never experienced before." Dr.
Chen smiled with obvious understanding. Agency is exactly the right word. When you control the resources and make the decisions, you can choose relationships and situations based on your values rather than your fears. As the celebration continued into the evening, Margaret received unexpected news that provided a fitting conclusion to the journey that had begun with Richard's betrayal and manipulation. Linda approached her with a phone call from an attorney representing Richard's estate, informing her that Richard had died suddenly from a heart attack and that his will included provisions that might affect Emma's inheritance. Margaret felt surprised by her own reaction to this news. Instead of satisfaction or vindication, she experienced mainly relief that Emma would no longer need to navigate the complicated emotions and practical challenges that came with having Richard as a father. His death meant that Emma could remember the positive aspects of their relationship without ongoing disappointment about his financial irresponsibility and ethical failures. The inheritance situation proved to be complex, as Richard's legal problems had resulted in significant debts that exceeded the value of his remaining assets. However, Margaret's financial independence meant that Emma's security was not affected by Richard's financial failures. The lesson about self-reliance that Margaret had worked so hard to teach had protected Emma from consequences that might have been devastating for someone depending on family wealth or support. Emma handled the news of her father's death with the same mature composure that had characterized her response to his professional scandals. She grieved the relationship she had wished for while accepting the reality of who Richard had been and the choices he had made. Margaret provided emotional support without trying to manage Emma's feelings or offer premature comfort that might interfere with her daughter's natural processing of loss and disappointment. The funeral service was small and private, attended mainly by Emma, David, Margaret, and a few of Richard's professional colleagues who had maintained contact despite his legal troubles. Sophia did not attend, apparently having moved to another state after their relationship ended. Margaret felt no animosity toward Richard as she watched his casket being lowered into the ground, only sadness for the wasted potential and the family relationships that had been damaged by his choices. In the months following Richard's death, Margaret found that her life settled into patterns of contentment and purpose that she had never imagined possible during her marriage or the difficult years immediately following her divorce. The venue business continued to thrive, providing both financial security and professional fulfillment. Her consulting work helped dozens of women each year develop the skills and confidence needed to build independent lives after relationship transitions. Most importantly, her relationship with Emma deepened into the kind of adult friendship that Margaret had always hoped they might achieve. They spoke regularly about business decisions, parenting challenges, and personal goals, treating each other as equals rather than falling into the hierarchical patterns that had characterized their interactions when Emma was younger and Margaret was focused on managing family dynamics. One afternoon in late autumn, as Margaret was reviewing applications for her annual scholarship program that provided business education grants to women leaving abusive relationships, she received a letter that brought her story full circle in an unexpected way. The letter was from a young woman named Jennifer who had attended Emma's wedding as a college friend and had been inspired by Margaret's confrontation with Richard to examine her own relationship patterns. Jennifer wrote that watching Margaret assert her boundaries with such clarity and preparation had given her the courage to leave an emotionally abusive marriage and pursue the graduate education in business administration that her ex-husband had discouraged. She was now completing her MBA and starting a nonprofit organization that provided financial literacy education to women in domestic violence shelters. Your example showed me that it's possible to be strong without being cruel and strategic without being manipulative, Jennifer wrote. I learned that protecting yourself and standing up for your values doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you someone who refuses to accept treatment that diminishes your worth. Margaret felt deeply moved by this unexpected validation that her choices had influenced positive changes in other people's lives. The confrontation at Emma's wedding had been motivated by immediate needs to protect herself and her daughter, but it had apparently served as a model for other women facing similar challenges with manipulation and boundary violations. As winter settled over Rosewood Manor and the event season wound down, Margaret began planning the venue's expansion into year-round operations that would include corporate retreats, holiday parties, and winter wedding celebrations. The business had grown beyond her original vision, creating opportunities for innovation and development that excited her professional instincts. She also began writing a memoir that would tell the complete story of her transformation from accommodating wife to independent business owner. The book would combine personal narrative with practical guidance, offering both emotional support and strategic advice for women navigating divorce, financial recovery, and late-life career changes. On the 5th anniversary of Emma's wedding, Margaret walked through the same rose garden where her confrontation with Richard had taken place, but this time she carried Grace on her hip while Emma and David planned their own anniversary celebration. The 3 generations of women represented different approaches to independence and strength, but they shared a common commitment to building relationships based on mutual respect rather than traditional expectations or societal pressures. Grace reached for the rose petals with the fearless curiosity of someone who had never learned to doubt her right to explore and claim beautiful things for herself. Margaret hoped that her granddaughter would grow up in a world where women's economic independence was assumed rather than exceptional, where financial literacy was taught alongside emotional intelligence, and where the ability to establish and maintain boundaries was recognized as a fundamental life skill. The property around them represented more than successful business investment. It symbolized the possibility of transformation at any stage of life, the power of strategic thinking combined with emotional courage, and the difference between seeking revenge and simply refusing to accept unacceptable treatment. As the sun set over Rosewood Manor, casting golden light across the gardens where so many couples had celebrated their commitment to building lives based on love and mutual support, Margaret felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this place of security and purpose. The woman who had once measured her worth by how much she could sacrifice for others had learned to define success by how effectively she could protect and develop her own capabilities while using those strengths to help other people achieve their own independence and dignity. The future stretched ahead with possibilities that were entirely under her control, limited only by her imagination and ambition rather than by other people's expectations or manipulations. Margaret had built something lasting and valuable that reflected her own vision and values, creating a legacy that would benefit not only Emma and Grace, but also the countless women who would find courage and practical guidance in her example of transformation and renewal. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click it and check them out.